We want to talk about removing the steel shaft from an iron in this case, and I've got the club clamped in the vise, which normally I'm going to use a vise anytime I can to do this to secure it. We've got a couple of different methods for heating. Primarily, in most cases, if you're going to remove a steel shaft from a standard or traditional type iron, we would just use a propane torch for our heat source in this case. But we could use butane, either the larger butane or the micro torch. We could also use a heat gun. The difference being, especially if we use a heat gun, it's going to take a longer period of time to heat this to break the epoxy bond. I'm just going to use the propane torch in this case. Put my safety glasses on. Always want to work safe. And the first thing I'm going to do in this case is I want to get the ferrule off of the club. I don't really need to do that, and if I just heat the hosel for the purpose of removing the club head, the ferrule is going to start to burn and melt and basically make a mess. So I'm just going to go ahead and take it off. And when I do have a steel shaft in an iron like this and I'm using a propane torch, there's nothing there for me to really damage with some heat. So I can just take and put a little bit of heat on that ferrule just to warm it up, soften it up, take a knife and just carefully cut it away. Get the ferrule off of there. And at that point now I'm ready to go ahead and heat my club head. General rule of thumb with propane is it's probably going to take about 15 or 20 seconds worth of heat. If it's been a high impact epoxy, it's going to take that much time to break the head loose from the shaft. If it was a fast setting epoxy, it may not quite take that long. But also a general rule of thumb is once you see the epoxy starting to burn at the top of the hosel, you can probably take it off at that point without any problems. See it start to burn and smoke a little bit and even pop a little bit. I'm going to put on a pair of gloves, leather gloves. And I'm even going to pull and clamp the shaft just a little bit farther up. By doing that, I'm twisting and pulling against the tapered section of the shaft. It should hold it a little easier. Twist and pull it off. I always stand to the side. If by chance this club had been swing weighted with lead powder and a cork down the shaft under pressure, sometimes that will force the head off, and you don't want it shooting out and getting all over you at that, or getting and burning you at that point. I like to take a brush at that point as well, while this head is still warm, and just take a brush down the inside of the hosel to clean it out. Get all that old epoxy out of there. It's even a good idea if you take a drill bit, just a little bit smaller in diameter than a hosel, run it down in there by hand, because it will get any epoxy that will be right on the bottom of the board. The brush will get anything off the sidewalls. This way we can get this head pretty well prepped and ready to go if we're going to reassemble it as well. I've got heat marks on the hosel. Once it cools down, I'll take some Blue Away on a paper towel, and I can just wipe those heat marks off the club and have it ready to go to reinstall a new shaft in it at that point. If I were reusing my shaft, it's a good idea to take a knife and just scrape off any excess epoxy as well. And then I would take it to the belt sander, or I could even take a strip of sandpaper by hand and re-abrade the shaft tip to clean it up, so that again it's ready to be reinstalled into another club. If there is epoxy in the inside of the shaft, you will need an air release to reinstall it, so you may have to take a drill bit and drill up through there to clean out that epoxy out of the inside of the shaft. But at that point you would be ready to reinstall this shaft into another club, or once you got the Blue Away, you'd be ready to reinstall a new shaft into your club head. All right, we want to explain reshafting an iron, but something a little different in this case. We want to explain if we had to save the ferrule. It's not something we do all that often, but occasionally we have to do that. Possibly in the case of this golf club, we have a multi-design ferrule that's been used, and maybe the customer wants that. We don't happen to have that in stock in our shop, so we have to try to save that ferrule for the purpose of reusing it. I'm going to clamp the club in the vise just as we did previously, in reshafting. I've got to protect that stuff. I've got to keep it cold. I'm going to use, again, a propane torch to heat, and I'm going to heat the hosel in the range of about 15-20 seconds to break the epoxy bond. But also I've got to keep this cool or I'm just going to melt this. So a couple ways to do that. For years we just took a paper towel and we get it wet and just wrap that around that ferrule as a way to keep it wet and cool as we heat. Another method that we use today, we have a product called Club Shield, which is basically like a gelled water, and we can just spray Club Shield right on the ferrule and it will stay there and it will keep this cool while we heat, so that we can heat this club. If during the process of heating it starts to kind of bubble or blister a little bit, we can always apply a little bit more, but it really shouldn't be an issue because we shouldn't have to heat really longer than about 10 or 15 seconds to do this. I'm going to slide my club down just a little bit further. This way I'm clamping the shaft where it tapers, and it will, when I pull and twist on the head, it will hold that a lot better and hold it more securely. Again, put the safety glasses on. I'm going to use propane torch. I'm just going to heat one side of the hosel. I am going to try to stay a little farther down than I normally would because, again, I want to stay away from burning that ferrule. I'm going to try to go about 10, no more than 15 seconds here, and then hopefully I can remove this shaft. And I will keep an eye on my watch this time as I do this. So that's approximately 15 seconds. Again, I'm going to put gloves on because, again, especially since I've heated down further, this will be a little warmer this time. You can get in here and see. Maybe not yet. There we go. And again, carefully as I get the head loose, step to the side. I don't want anything shooting out of the shaft that would get all over me or possibly burn me to blood. Again, I like to clean it with a wire brush. And again, I'll also take a drill bit usually and go down the inside to clean the bottom of the bore as well. Get epoxy off the bottom of the hosel or the bottom of the bore. Set that down to dry, or I could quench it in some water to dry. Again, come back with some blue away to take away the heat marks. Now, I'm ready to see how I did with my ferrule. In this case, and again, this is just gelled water, so I can just wipe that off with my finger, not hurt anything, and that's not very warm. Now, I'm going to take a Loctite shaft holder, and I'm going to clamp the shaft in the largest hole. I'm not trying to clamp the shaft tight. I just want something that I can use to tap against this ferrule to bring it off. I'm going to set it in the vise, and then I'm going to take a hammer, and I'm just going to carefully tap the shaft back through the ferrule. So I get it basically flush, and then I should be able to pull it the rest of the way off. Maybe. Like that. And we've saved our ferrule. We will probably have to take a knife and just kind of detail this edge where there's a little bit of a countersink on the ferrule. Make sure that bottom edge is cleaned up so that when we reuse our ferrule, it's going to fit together against the top of the hosel on the club again when we put our new shaft in there. But we did save our multi-designed ferrule in this case, so we could reuse that again if we needed to. Okay? All right, we want to talk about taking or removing graphite shafts. And when we remove a graphite shaft, the very first thing we have to do is we've got to get the ferrule out of the way. Graphite shaft pullers work by putting pressure against the top of the hosel of the club to force the head straight off. And the ferrule just simply gets in the way. So unless by chance we could somehow get it loose and slide it up the shaft out of the way, that would be the only option we ever have to save it. So the normal rule of thumb is we're just going to cut it off and get rid of it. Well, I like to take a heat gun in this case to warm up that ferrule. And I like the heat gun in this case better than a torch because I'm not putting direct flame right on the painted metal wood or on the finished coat of the shaft itself. So this is just a much safer method of just warming that ferrule up a little bit, so that when we take it off, it'll cut off a lot easier. So I warm it up. I like to clamp it in a vise, and I'm going to clamp it with the club in a toe down position. I always cut to the back side of the hosel. If by chance I slip with this knife and I scratch the finish on this head, at least I've scratched it on the back. And if I don't have the wherewithal to fix this club or fix that finish, at least when I set the club in the playing position the next time, I won't see the scratches on the club. So again, just cut through the ferrule carefully, cut it off, and we get rid of it. And at that point, now we can go ahead and mount it in a shaft puller and start taking it apart. Okay, we've previously shown you how to first remove the ferrule before mounting the club in the graphite shaft puller. Any graphite shaft puller is going to work by putting pressure against the top of the hosel. So saving the ferrule is not really an option unless you could slide it far enough back up the shaft to clear the clamp, and then slide it back off or slide it back down and use it again, and that generally is not going to happen. Once the club is mounted in our puller, we have a ratchet wrench that we use to apply pressure to remove the head. In this case, I'm going to heat with a heat gun on a high setting, keeping the nozzle of the heat gun approximately 3 to 4 inches away from the back of the hosel. I heat only the back side of the hosel, so that if by chance we were to burn this finish and we can't fix it right now, at least when we put the club in the playing position the next time, we won't see those heat marks. If this has been done with a normal high-impact epoxy, I could probably heat easily for a minute, minute and a half. I'm going to heat for a minute before I even bother to try to take this apart. If it is a fast-setting epoxy, at 1 minute's worth of heating, it may come off. I always use a rule of thumb that if I've heated with a heat gun for 3 minutes continuously and the head hasn't come off, I will shut the heat gun off for a minute, just to be careful not to burn the finish or hopefully not damage the shaft, especially if I'm trying to save the shaft for reuse. At that point, if I've heated for 3 minutes, it hasn't come off, I've shut it off, I've waited for a minute. I then go and heat for 30 seconds, stop for 30 seconds, heat for 30 seconds, continue to use that process until I can get the club head to come loose. And in doing it in that manner, it's far less likely to ever damage the finish of the club head or the shaft tip. When I get to a minute, I'll start ratcheting here, continuing to apply heat. And there's the club head. Once the club head is broken loose, and it has, I continue to ratchet the head all the way off. And then we would go, as we've already shown you, to use a brush to clean out carefully clean out the inside of the hosel bore, to prep it for reuse. Also to remove the shaft, and how to clean and prep the shaft and check it to make sure that it is fine for being reused again. Okay? The next one we want to show removing a composite crown club head. In this case, we have one of our CT250s. This is a composite crown. When we're working with a composite crown, we have to keep that area cool. And there are a couple of ways we can do that. Get the puller set up again here. Clamp again, turn it so I can heat the back. Just snug the shaft. I can always, if it doesn't hold right, I can always come back and tighten it a little more, but we don't want to over tighten and break it. And I've taken a wet paper towel that I'm going to wrap around the club head. Another tip I've seen for doing this is to take a wet sock and pull it up over the club head, and I could see where that would work real well as a way to keep this cool. We can also use a product called Club Shield, which is basically a gelled water that we could spray on here if we felt we needed to get this a little wetter, a little cooler, if you will, to stay cooler while we heat. That would be another option. In this case, I'm going to use a micro torch this time to do this. I'm going to heat. I can concentrate heat right to the back side of the hosel. I can concentrate it to a finer area where the heat gun will spread it over a wider area. This way I can have a better chance of keeping it away from any composite crown or any composite material that might be on the club head. Rule of thumb should still be approximately the same. It should take me about a minute's worth of heating before I even really need to try to take this off. I'm going to move it up and down along the back of the hosel. The shaft penetration into this hosel bore is probably about 1.25 inches, 1 3/8, which is fairly normal. So we can move it up and down in that area. Possibly we could get this to come apart a little bit faster. Just about 30 seconds there. Let's just see if that's going to do anything. There we go, in about 35 seconds, so this may have well been done with a faster setting epoxy that has a lower breakdown temperature. Again, we can take the club head, let the puller take it all the way off. We can remove our wet towel and check and make sure. Again, this isn't at all warm where I'm holding it here, so we did a good job of keeping that area cool, because there would be an epoxy seamer on there, and we don't want that to break loose and come loose later on. And again, we go about checking the shaft and prepping it for reuse just as we did before. And then the final one we want to explain is some of the older pings. In this case, I have a ping TISI titanium, and these pings were shafted into an adapter sleeve similar to this. The original ping one's a little bit different than this. The original ping one actually would have a 3-letter code on the side that if you went to their website and looked up that particular model of driver and brought up that code, it would tell you what the lie angle and what the face angle of that plug was. Now this one we do a little bit differently, in that we're going to use a heating rod that we're going to put down the inside of the shaft. We're going to heat this rod in 20-second intervals. Well, it's important to make sure that your heating rod is going all the way down inside your club head, all the way to the bottom. If it's stopping up here somewhere, you'll need to take probably an 1/8 inch, 12-inch drill bit and drill down in and clean out the epoxy that's inside the shaft. I've already done that with this particular club. Now I'm going to take this ping ferrule guard, slide it down over the club. I've cut the shaft off in this case to about 10 to 12 inches. We don't save the shaft in this case. That's not really an option, because when we put this heating rod down inside the club head, we're going to be heating directly on, laying heated fibers directly onto the walls of the shaft, and it will damage that. So saving the shaft's not really an option here. This time we're going to heat the rod with a propane torch. We're going to heat for 20 seconds. We don't want to get this too hot that we could end up burning the adapter actually from the inside out. Just an area about 1.25 inches probably that we want to get warm or get hot, and they'll get quite hot. Let me slide that in. Let that sit for probably about a minute, at least 30 seconds or so, but generally about a minute. And then I'll try to take this off with the puller, and if it doesn't come off, I'm going to pull the rod back out, heat it again for 20 seconds, and go through the process again. And I found in my experience of doing these, generally it's the second time I heat that these things will come loose. They don't generally come loose the first time. Doesn't mean they won't, but they haven't generally done that. Except this time it did. And again, pry it all the way off. Okay, this time when you take your wire brush, be cautious about going in here too quickly, because if this is warm and it's soft, you'll distort its shape. We want to leave it in the shape it's in, so it's a good idea to let this one cool down a little bit, and then go in with a brush to clean it out, possibly even carefully in there with a drill bit to clean that out as well. Okay? Just like that. Okay, we've removed our graphite shaft through the different methods that we showed, and now we want to get our shaft prepared to reinstall, and there's some things that we need to do. You also need to be aware that if you're going to save a graphite shaft for the purpose of reusing it, again, it becomes your liability as a club maker. Shaft manufacturers are not going to warrant a shaft that's been installed for a second time because they just can't guarantee that it was removed properly in the first place. And we're going to show you some things to look for here to make sure that your shaft is good for reinstallation. The first thing, again, after I've removed the shaft from the club head, I like to just take a knife and just carefully scrape away any excess epoxy. I've got a little bit more epoxy right there. That's where the countersink in the club head is, and there will always be a little more epoxy right there. It also is generally the spot where if a shaft fails, that it seems to fail in that area as well, because it takes a little more heat. So I've lightly just scraped that away, not trying to gouge or do anything, just to clean this off. Okay? The other thing, I've got a plug of epoxy stuck in the tip of the shaft, and I want to see if I can get that out of there, or I've got to get it out of there if I'm going to reinstall. One way is if I've got a long rod that I can run down the inside of the shaft. While it's still warm, there's a good chance that I can knock this out of here, or maybe not. In this case, maybe not. It's moving a little bit, it doesn't want to come loose, but it's always a good thing to try that first. If you can knock that plug out of there, it makes cleaning a little bit easier. If not, I'm going to clamp the shaft into vise. I'm going to take what we call the self-centering drill shaft chuck here, just modified drill chuck that we use, and it threads onto the end of the shaft. And I have an 1/8 inch, 6 inch long drill bit that comes with it. And there's a collar on here that's going to keep this drill bit centered in that shaft. So when I go through there, I shouldn't have any concerns about drilling into the sidewall of the shaft. Just carefully drill that out, and now I've got an air release running up through the inside of the shaft so that I can properly reinstall it. If you don't clear that air release, the shaft under pressure will want to force its way back out of the club head. The other thing I like to do, as I mentioned, I don't like to sand this again on a machine. I like to sand it by hand, and I've just taken a strip of 150 grit cloth back sandpaper here, and I'm just going to basically, if you will, use a light pressure with a shoe shine method here, being careful not to sand it too high up the shaft either, and just carefully sand this shaft to clean it up, get off the old epoxy. Okay, always remember epoxy bonds to a clean abraded surface, so we have to have this clean, we've got to have the inside of the club head clean. And so now I've cleaned that off. I've also cleaned it off to where I can do a visual inspection. And I can also go around a lot of times with my fingernail, can I catch an edge? If I can catch an edge of a fiber somewhere, or an edge period, chances are the shaft was either over abraded the first time, or in removing it there was some damage done to the shaft. I also like to take the shaft and I generally put it on the floor and put pressure on the tip of that shaft in different directions, and I wait until the shaft tip is cooled down before I do that, because if it's warm it will bend. So wait until it cools down, put pressure on it, pick it back up, do a visual inspection again. If you don't see any frayed fibers or can't catch any edges with your fingernail, you should be safe to reinstall this. Also check into the club head, make sure the size fits. This is one of those cases generally when I reinstall a graphite shaft that I will use either quick center, which is a shafting bead type of material, or use the shafting beads. I like the quick center, it takes a little more, fills up a little more space if necessary, to make sure that I keep that shaft centered in the bore.